some reasonable clothes on today. Yeah, for the last 40 years I was the principal investigator of the Christchurch Health and Development Study, which is a longitudinal study of a cohort or a group of 1,265 children born in 1977. And we studied those young people from birth up to the age of 35 on, I think, 24 occasions. And we prepared a series of papers, reports, books and publications, and currently I think we have done 465 of them. And in terms of the statistics, these days you can go online and count up citations, that is other people's references, and the study has been cited over nearly 23,000 times.
Wow.
So it's quite a well-known study.
Oh.
I mean, my major routine was going to work, working hard, and then coming home and trying to relax. Successes.
Okay.
Now, one of the things about doing research is that your research is subject to very much critical peer review. And to really become successful, you've got to work out how to deal with the reviews and the reviewers and all of those things. And once you learn the strategy, it's dead easy. But it's learning how to beat the system, as it were, and what to do and what not to do. And that probably took about 10 years. And learning to predict what people are going to do and how to manage it. You see, we were interviewing mothers at home with children. And the first thing is that if you were to send a man round, there's immediately attention, because they were home by themselves with the man. Not only that, we were asking questions about sexual abuse and sexual health and all of this. Now, I'm certain that most women, when confronted with a man saying, you know, have you been sexually abused and have you had anal sex and all of this sort of thing, would find it mortifying. So, and then and having a woman around the same age, well-educated, middle-class woman with a training in nursing, social work, education, psychology. I'd run interview teams in the government, and I learned about all of this. And basically, people respond best in conversations to people they relate to and they are alike. So if you've got women with children, you don't want to send them a 17-year-old young woman to talk with them, or an old granny. You want someone about their age with their outlook and perspective. I don't see that as being hard. There's nothing sexist about it. I mean, if I were to interview a group of men, probably you might want to choose male interviewers then on certain topics. That was one of the most important things we learnt about research, was that lots of people want to, talk about how complicated life is, how so many things are going on, and how. What we found worked was to take one issue, very clearly defined, and the turning point was the paper I mentioned to you on cigarette smoking. The question was very clear. If your mother smokes, does it increase your risk of having bronchitis and pneumonia? Very, very tight, clear question. And you've got the smoking, you've got the bronchitis, and there's the relationship. And then you've got a control, statistically, for the context. And nearly all our papers are like that. Same question. The question about sexual abuse is the same, but more complicated. If you are sexually abused, what are the consequences? The use of cannabis, exactly the same. So, and we learned a strategy of getting the focus on cannabis, cigarette smoking, sexual abuse, what you will, as the topic, as the driver, looking at the outcomes and writing very clearly about how that is related to that, and trying to tell it simply. Not writing papers saying, oh, well, personality is so complicated, and people just get lost in the complexity, because life's a lot of small bits coming together. And together they're hugely complicated, but you can isolate passages from the complexity and understand them. I used to walk around the garden pushing them over, talking to. One of the things I told people about writing, and it's very important, is to always read out what you've written. Lots of people don't do this, but I will I will talk my papers out as I write them. But you can hear them, so you can listen to them, because writing you need to have an ear for. It's not just putting the words down. You know, when you actually, if you read it out, your prose, you will find out how clumsy it is and how it doesn't work. Now, and the other thing for all of the players is always write in short sentences, not lengthy qualified sentences, because that's harder to read. And I learned that, talking about that, I learned that off a book by Kurt Vonnegut. What was it called? Forgotten now. It was, anyway, but Kurt, he wrote these very short, the whole thing was written in very short sentences.
A key point was, what's the question, show me the data, and does the data answer the question?
That's right.
It's simple.
Well, it is simple.
Yeah.
All of this is very simple in theory. I mean, it's hard in execution, but it's simple in its basic ideas. No, I can't really. I mean, I can talk about moments when I was doing research, when I had a real problem, and I learned technique to overcome them.
Okay.
And how. So, I mean, quite a lot of techniques, and this is technical, is to learn about what is called the generalized linear model and realize that all of these statistical methods all derive from one common framework, and that if you grasp the common framework you can learn anything new very quickly. But that took quite a long time to learn. No, well, if you're going to do this research, you've got to do the statistics. You know, it's like people saying, you know, they want to cook but they don't like ovens. Come on, guys, you've got to do it. Well, the trouble is that all of the knowledge and evidence base is coming from the statistics, and if you avoid it, you miss the story. Well, I'm a technophobe. I don't like changing things. If things are working for me, I don't need to bother spending my time learning it. You know, it's like the typewriter. I was quite happy typing papers on the typewriter. It worked. The transition to the word processors, went through the whole revolution, was actually long and difficult and bloody and accompanied with a lot of swearing. Having mastered it, I can say that it is much better than the typewriter. But, you know, if you want to write and communicate and do things, spending your time learning how to drive a machine and learning stuff you don't want to know really frustrates me. And I just don't like learning new technology because I know what I want to do, and this is just getting in my way.
That's right.
And but I suspect that, you know, that's the short-term view. The long-term view is actually you've got to do it because you'll fall so far behind. I mean, what happened, interestingly, about my typewriter is I had to stop the typewriter because I couldn't get any more ribbons for it. See, I don't have any time for stupidity, and I let people know. I don't suffer fools gladly. And in conversations, that's bad because you intimidate people, and if you intimidate them, they get rid of you. That's probably what happens. But just telling people, you know, because a lot of this stuff to me is simple, but it doesn't seem simple to the people I talk to. Well, it hasn't come to nothing. It hasn't been as... We haven't done as well as we could have done had we had a perfect system that was responsive to research. And the trouble is that the New Zealand Public Service, which is the arbiter of all of this, not the politicians, the public service, is gripped by politics, and also conservatism. Risk taking is, you know, things we want to avoid. So, but I think that is changing, but it's going to take some time. I mean, there's a remarkably recent thing happened with Anne Tolley, going on about women who have multiple pregnancies. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, and then there's a group of social work people saying, oh, we shouldn't use coercive methods. Now, there's a perfectly simple methodology for dealing with this. It should require that when someone's in this situation, that you do get social work support, but part of that support requires liaison with family planning, that the people in the family planning offer people, and in the end, the person's got the right probably not to do it, but we have the obligation to make sure that they have every opportunity for the best advice and the best technology. Now, what's going on now is that they're just being left to row around, and they get in trouble again. And then people are arguing about coercion or not coercion. Good therapy and treatment isn't coercion, it's good practice. And Anne Tolley's on the one side sort of trying to say, oh, we should straighten them up, and the other people on the other side are saying, oh, well, we don't want to coerce them. But the middle is, what would be the best practice solution to this problem? And it's so blatantly obvious. Now, it may not work with everybody, but nothing works with everybody all of the time. But you're obliged to try your best. Well, yeah, okay, but you imagine this regimen, and I don't know anything about modern contraception, but in the 70s you had to take the pill every day, all of the time, and missing a couple of days at the wrong part of the cycle was enough to put you at risk. And that's what happened. It wasn't that people weren't using contraception, they were using the pill, and they were having failures with the pill. The most, not shocking, but the most outrageous piece of the study was our research into abortion, which I started off, and I'd read the literature, and I thought, oh, well, no, abortion doesn't have any mental health effects. The only reason that people having abortions have mental health problems is that they had them before the abortion. So we went out and to do the analysis and to write these refutations of the pro-life position. And John Horwood came back and he said, no, David, it's there. And we published a whole series of papers showing that women that following abortion, rates of mental health problems rose. And we have met over and over again with denial and demands and, oh no, this is wrong and the study's flawed. And, an attempt to explain away an unfortunate fact by inventing a counter-model. Exactly the same story that happened with the discovery of cigarettes and smoking in the tobacco industry. I mean, every time you discover something that people don't like, they can find a way of doing it. But it does. Abortion is associated with small but detectable increases in probably substance use disorders in particular, and suicidal thoughts and so forth. And it mainly happens to probably about 25% of women who find it really distressing. I mean, that's what you find. And the distressed women have an elevated risk. That doesn't seem at all striking to me. But the amount of denial and pushback around that topic is huge. There is another area like this we were about to, and that's domestic violence. And the rhetoric of domestic violence has been that it's something that men do to women. It's called, now our studies and the Dunedin study, and we're about to publish a monograph on this, show that men and women are equally violent in relationships. So women are doing as much hitting, and they're starting hitting and all the rest of it. There are differences in the gender, that women tend to be more prone to get injured, and they get more upset and more likely to be depressed. So domestic violence is more costly to women. But it's not the case that that's because men are beating women. Most of it is what's been called common couple violence, where they're both going at it, and both parties are to blame. And it's not a gender issue, it's an issue of dysfunctionally bad behaving people. But that's been completely reconstructed in all of our literature and discussion. And any time you want to hear about domestic violence, it's violence against women. I think that there are probably three parts to the story. Firstly, that feminists certainly did highlight things that would not have otherwise been found, and childhood sexual abuse is certainly the case. However, in the process of those discoveries, they were reconstructed into gender theory, and for example, in the case of childhood sexual abuse, it was seen as an exemplar of patriarchy, and it was only men abusing children. But the truth is that 25% of those subject to sexual abuse are abused by women. That got completely swept under the carpet. And so the good of the feminist rhetoric gets done by the ideology of it. And I think that gradually, and also there are views of that people, that males and females are just the same and they should have exactly the same life course outcomes, which everybody knows isn't really true, except those people who are committed to trying to impose that view on others. And so there's been the value-laden component of feminism, which has tried to reconstruct research so that it meets the agendas of the theology, rather than saying, yes, well, these are men and women are different, but these are the points of similarity, these are the points of difference, and so forth. But, yes, what I have learnt about work is that you should go to work very hard in your office, do not go to meetings, do not join clubs, do not join gatherings, sit down and do what you're meant to do, which is actually, in my case, was actually prepare scientific papers and design research. So I used to get to work probably about 7:30, 8 o'clock, and I'd probably work straight the way through till about 3 o'clock. And that was about the end of it. Well, I had a good relationship with my team because what we had, it wasn't so much leadership, it was that there were very clearly defined roles. And everybody knew their roles and they did them. And my job was to make sure that everybody knew their roles and did them. And that's what I see leadership as being. And also the people have got to respect you. I mean, I think if you're in charge of it all, you've got to be ahead of everybody a little bit. And if you're not, they'll run rings around you. Yes, small groups. Oh, I talk to lots of politicians. Remember, politicians don't do the policy. Politicians enunciate policies and they are done by their ministries. Politicians generally are quite astute about what they would like to get done. And the people are fairly in good agreement about this. It's getting it done. And it's at that point of the ministry of translating intent into action. And a lot of the troubles that New Zealand has run into in its social policy arose in the 80s and 90s with Rogernomics and Ruthernomics and all the right-wingonomics, where with the so-called funder-provider split. That is, that the government agencies were funders of policies which they purchased from various community-level providers. That works very well when you've got a well-established service like hip transplants or whatever, where it's all worked out. But when it comes to developing new and innovative ideas, most of the community agencies just don't have the resourcing and the time to do it. And so, but again, I think there is a gradual recognition of the need for government to take a greater leadership role in policy development rather than just handing it over to the community. I think the rhetoric that the community knows best is fading rapidly. Oh, certainly what I would have liked to have done more is to have a greater impact on social policy. One of the biggest frustrations of doing research is that most of the research I do gets strained through the Ministry of Social Development, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Justice, and is regulated by policy analysts. Now, the policy analysts are not necessarily trained researchers. They use a different methodology for deciding policy, which is basically consensus. How policy gets decided in most New Zealand government departments is that they get a whole lot of people, whom they call stakeholders, into a room, and they sit round a table and everyone has an opinion and it all gets written down, and that leads to the policy. Now, my argument always been is that they need to read the evidence, review the evidence, and start from the evidence rather than the opinion. But government agencies are not, to be fair, there is a gradual recognition of evidence-based approaches, but it's been quite slow.
Okay.
And what that means is that a lot of our useful research hasn't been taken up at the speed I would have liked to see it. And the other thing is the small size of democracy. New Zealand is a country, I think, with one of the greatest potential in the world. It's a well-educated, moderately affluent, socially oriented democracy, and with good leadership. I'm not sure we've had that good leadership in the last 20 years. It could be actually an outstanding country. Oh, I think Jenny Shipley.
Yeah. I
knew Jenny Shipley. I used to talk to her. Helen Clark was competent and good. Jenny Shipley. Bolger was all right. Well, I'd probably have a drink. And then I would sit down. I think that what I've always wondered about politics is what happened if you actually could develop a consensus parliament, rather than having parties to get all the parties in and say, really, I want to run this as a round table, with you all round the table, rather than a debating chamber. That's what I would do. But it's probably very difficult to achieve. Well, that's the other way. Most things are run that way. Politics is the only really blatant, aside from courts, the blatantly adversarial. Every time they think they should. And I'm fairly proactive, and I think that if people don't like something, they should speak out. I don't necessarily think that this needs to be done in the media, but these days you've got a lot of mechanisms. You've got emails, you've got Facebooks, you've got a whole power of electronic media for people, blogging, for people to articulate things. Probably the most powerful way, if you can do it, obviously, is well-researched evidence presented well. But I'll go back right to one of the earliest findings, which was an interesting one, which was on cigarette smoking and young children. And basically what we found is that the children who were exposed to mothers who smoked had rates of lower respiratory illness, that's bronchitis and pneumonia, which were about twice the rate of those of non-smokers. And that was published through 1980, I think, and it was one of the first papers in the area, and it led to this whole issue about smoking in children and passive smoking and all of those things. We've done a lot of papers on cannabis looking at both the prevalence of use and its harmful consequences. And when we started doing the cannabis research, the popular conventional wisdom was that cannabis was a harmless drug, and any claims of it being harmful were overstated and misleading. We have done now a series of papers showing basically three things. Firstly, the use of cannabis in New Zealand is remarkably high. Of our cohort members, by the age of 21, 80% had used cannabis at least once. Wow. There are about 10% heavy users who meet the criteria for dependence. In terms of harmful effects, heavy use, not occasional one joint use, but heavy use is associated with increased risks of school dropout, of depression, of psychotic symptoms, of motor vehicle accidents, welfare dependence, and related outcomes. It is not the case that the heavy users of cannabis get away with it. It is a harmful drug, and claims that it's otherwise are not supported by the evidence.
Okay.
We recently did a large study or a paper on this with a consortium of Australian groups. So there was about 4 or 5 studies from Australia, in which we published in the Lancet, showing the extent of harms of early use of cannabis. We have published quite a lot of papers on sexual abuse, and also we published a book too in the 1990s. Basically, again, sexual abuse. When we started doing this research, I was very suspicious about that idea of sexual abuse. I thought it was overstated. I thought it was part of a feminist rhetoric, and I thought that our research would show that things weren't as bad as people said. Quite to the contrary, the evidence actually showed that sexual abuse was one of the most important childhood traumas, which has multiple adverse consequences. Firstly, it's associated with increased risks of common mental health problems, and notably depression, anxiety, and related disorders. It's a strong predictor of suicidality, and also, interestingly, sexual risk-taking. Sexually abused young people are much more likely to become pregnant or catch sexually transmitted diseases. So of all of the childhood problems and traumas, I think sexual abuse needs to be put at the centre of policy, and it is of course one of the most difficult traumas to deal with, because typically it is committed on the young person, not by the family, contrary to belief, but basically by friends and acquaintances and people who know the family. Yes, it taught me that you can get very addicted, and that addiction is a very hard thing to get over. Once you're on the train, it's very hard to get off. And it took me a lot of effort to give up smoking. First cigarette I smoked was 7. By the time I was 15, I was smoking 10 a day, and I was smoking 20 a day when I was about 40. And I think I stopped smoking when I was 50. So I smoked for a very long time. The evidence suggests that price increases are the strongest and most effective way of stopping people smoking. That exhorting people not to smoke or putting ads on TV and doing all that doesn't work as well as prices. So I don't know whether I would have done, but certainly if you were to have a policy, increase the costs. And of course, the trouble is if you do progressively increase the costs, you run the risk of developing black markets. But increasing the cost is the best. Stopping smoking, and taking up my present job. Was taking my present job up, and I was deciding to run a study in 1976, and the other one was stopping smoking. critical, intellectually critical, and disputatious. That's my business. I am what they describe as a big picture thinker. That is, if you give me a question or a problem, generally I can see my way through it. My weakness is that I'm not very good at detail. That's why I used to work with my colleague John Horwood, who does the statistics and the detail, and I do the big picture, and I write very well. I write very quickly. So I can write a 3,000 word paper in a morning. No.
No? Not at all?
No. You can't, if you are going to take up social research, particularly of the kind I do, you have got to be prepared to stand up and say, look, I don't care what you say or what you think, that is what we have found, and we don't resile from it simply because it doesn't please you. Difficult. Disputatious. Critical. Probably for some of the contributions I've made to applied policy. And one of those things, of course, is the Early Start Home Visiting Programme, which was set up in Christchurch, which, interestingly, when we evaluated it, with a randomised experiment, and it's the only programme, home visiting programme outside of the US that's recognised in the reviews. So down here we set up our own effective home visiting programme. Another area I would like to have interest is our work that we've done on conduct problems in young people and the development of policies in those areas.